Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're finally going to talk about Studio 54. I have a number of clips that I want to show us for this section. One is a documentary that is slightly more recent. Another one has footage that was around at the time that Studio 54 was in the height of its glamour. And then lastly, I have a walkthrough, a digital reproduction of what it might have been like to travel through Studio 54. The archival footage is really wonderful, but it kind of doesn't give you an idea as to the vastness of the space. Earlier on this year, probably about 6 months ago or so, I ended up going to the Brooklyn Museum to check out their Studio 54 exhibit, which was really wonderful. I don't think it's running anymore, but in retrospect, what was interesting about it, looking at this model, is they did try to set it up as close to the layout of the venue as possible, which was really a technological wonder for the time, and something that was like larger than life, almost like being in a Broadway production in terms of the lighting and architecture and, you know, the costume design of the individuals who were attending these really lavish events and parties. So the first thing I want to show you is something closer to the time of Studio 54, and then we'll watch a little bit of the documentary and then do the walkthrough. So let me go ahead and pull up our first listening example.
It was the first club that you could really look upon as defining a particular decade or era. In the 60s, it was the Beatles. In the 70s, it was Studio 54.
I like it because it's really the nightclub of the future. It's a kind of culmination of a sort of nightclub that's been arriving gradually for the last 10 years.
I like the atmosphere of Studio 54. I've been to a lot of discotheques and I don't like them.
What's the difference?
All around the world I've been. I don't know, the feeling. I mean, the excitement of the props coming down and the balcony. It's just exciting, honestly.
When you hear the name Studio 54, what does that do?
I'm ready to have a good time.
There's Steve Rubell, the owner. Studio 54, the one we have to thank for all these fabulous parties.
How you doing?
Well, how do you do it, Steve? I mean, night after night, Andy Warhol, Bella Abzug, Shirley MacLaine. Every time I come in here, there's Warren Beatty or some stars. How have you done it?
You do it.
He never got used to it. I mean, celebrities would just floor him, you know? But he was just having such a good time, you know? And I think he had to take Quaaludes just to relax. And sometimes he would take too many, you know, because he'd be so excited. He'd be talking to me and spitting in my face at the same time.
People take good care of you here?
Yes, Steve's very nice.
What's Stevie like?
He's one of my favorite people because he's genuine and for real and honest. And that's what I like in people.
Steve Rubell was introduced to the whole sort of Warhol-Holston crowd by a PR woman called Carmen Delicio, but he actually became very friendly with Andy Warhol and Holston and Bianca Jagger and Liza Minnelli. That was his core group of famous friends. People didn't go with their bodyguards. People didn't sort of stand in corners, famous people, and just watch. They participated. Truman Capote was up in the DJ booth with Michael Jackson.
Most of the stars who come here don't come here for attention. They come here to dance. They come here to have fun. One night, Michael was here and Liza were here, and they were dancing. There was no photographers here. They didn't come here, and they were just dancing. And it was like a treat that people would have paid $100 a ticket for, I think, if they paid just to watch. We were all dancing together, right? And nobody cared, and they just come here to have a good time, you know.
In the beginning, Andy was going there with an entourage of people around him, like a wall of a defense, you know, to keep him distanced from me because he was terrifically shy. And he went to wanting to go out by himself and dancing by himself. Andy loved the art sales possibilities of an evening at Studio 54. He would come home some nights and cop thousands and thousands of dollars worth of portrait commissions.
I actually always liked the busboys and the waiters. I always liked the help. They're always very cute and young and so eager to please.
Busboys were propositioned a lot, you know, because we were like the most vulnerable employee. Just another, you know, pretty boy that somebody rich or powerful had to have, you know, in their collection or whatever. I was propositioned for sex by a famous designer, famous for boxer shorts and other things like that. It was a one-time deal.
How much did he pay you?
$300. Yeah.
So what can you get for 300?
I guess prostitutes sometimes call it around the world.
What's that?
Around the world is the full works. I was around the world with Freddie Mercury, Brett Davis from the Midnight Express.
What was your relationship to Rock Hudson?
I met Rock Hudson through in studio through Steve one night, and we hung out a couple of times. You know, we dosed a little bit. He was quite a man. Yeah. Andy Warhol was here practically every night. You know, he kind of freaked me out a little bit because I had found out that he wore wigs, and I was like, you know, that sort of threw me off.
This era came to an abrupt end on a cold December morning in 1978 when 30 FBI and tax officials raided the club. They apprehended Ian Schrager for possession of cocaine and seized bin liners full of cash stashed in wall cavities.
Based on, well, you know what all the warrants say. The warrants say we've received a tip or an information and belief the place is making a lot of money. Well, sure, they're making a lot of money and they're reporting a lot of taxes.
So before we get on to this next clip, which apparently is just going to play anyway, there's another documentary that I want to drop us into to talk a little bit about the other personalities that we saw. I love that footage of Michael Jackson, though. Considerably more outspoken in his younger years than in his later years. But he was a frequent visitor of Studio 54. Andy Warhol, as you noticed, made almost a nightly appearance. If you guys don't know about him, he's an interesting figure, not only as a socialite, but also a multidisciplinary artist, very eccentric taste. I also have just recently gone to the Warhol Museum as well. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was seeing just like his collection of collected goods, from plates to trinkets that he was into. His home and dwelling were very eclectic in terms of the mix of things, from very kind of circus items to very macabre things. Really had an interesting conglomeration of visual aesthetics in his apartment in New York. So Eliza Minnelli, also a name that comes through there. The list of famous people that come through Studio 54 is very extensive, and goes way above and beyond just musical talent. Although those are certainly some of the characters that we will see. But again, you put money, free time, nightlife, a emerging drug scene all together. It's going to be a slice of history worth worth revisiting to see kind of what led to some of these events. Anyway, so the video was talking about a raid that happened, and yes, truth be told, New York was in sort of in the doorway of Studio 54 a number of times. Within the first month that the club was opened, the New York Liquor Authority raided the place. They ended up reopening the next day, saying it was a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding was that they were waiting for their liquor license and had sort of a creative go-between in the interim while they were waiting for their liquor license. But the place was certainly corrupt in terms of its money handling. And in 1978, the nightclub was raided once more, and the owners, which we saw a little bit of footage of, were arrested for skimming. And eventually, the club closes 2 years late, not even a year plus later, February 2nd and 3rd in 1980 was the closing event for Studio 54. And the place was packed. Eliza Minnelli was there, Farrah Fawcett, Sylvester Stallone, Richard Gere, Jack Nicholson. It was a place to see and be seen, most certainly. One thing that wasn't covered in the first bit that I do want to talk about is actually what Studio 54 was before it was a discotheque. So CBS actually owned the building before it was sold off in 77. Yes, 77. So pre-77, it was owned by CBS, and CBS had bought it in the 1940s, early 1940s. It was an old theater that had been owned by a mobster in the previous decades. So CBS turns it into a location that ends up recording radio for the most part. That was a huge medium that was being experimented with in the 50s and 60s, most certainly. And they ended up, because mediums of messages do indeed change, let go of the building. And a number of people had been sort of eyeballing it as a possible venue for nightlife. And that's exactly what happened to it. So in any case, want to cover a little bit more footage of Studio 54 before we talk about some of the artists that passed through there.
When Behind the Music continues.
I talk to people from all over the world, and their ultimate dream is to get in 54.
Disco music was bringing everybody out to dance in 1977, but Studio 54 was not letting everybody in. This gave rise to another first, Studio's notorious door policy.
I want to get in here. I drove an hour and a half. I got an invitation. I want to be in the hottest spot in town.
Steve Rubel used to say that he wanted his perfect crowd to be a tossed salad.
You have a mix of the whole population of the world here.
If any one group got too out of proportion on any given night, it would be a damper on the energy. So if too many women or too many men or too many couples or too gay, or too black, or too young, or too old.
The boundaries between age and race and sexuality had given way to a new boundary, the velvet rope.
I don't even think there was ever a door policy before Studio 54.
Say people can't get in, and that's the one place they want to go.
Now you were either in or out.
Sitting here right as I am right now, in front of the rope, maybe first to go, and you don't get in. They don't acknowledge your presence.
Don't even know you're alive. Don't even know you exist.
For the first 3 or 4 weeks that we were open, there were 5 times as many people on the street than there were in the club.
And Halston and other people are going, Stevie, you know, why don't you let some people in? You know, there's no one in here. It's really boring, you know? And Steve said, I don't recognize anybody out there. I can't find anyone.
Steve had a tendency to be rude and obnoxious. You know, when he was out front, it was his club. You know, he'd choose the beautiful people, and, you know, he wouldn't think twice about insulting you about what you were wearing or how you look.
Oh, you're not shaved? There's no way in a million years you're gonna get in. It doesn't matter if you're not shaved. Listen, just go home.
If anyone ever came up and asked to come in, they'd never get in.
It doesn't change. It doesn't matter. My cousin is nice and I love her, but that doesn't affect coming into here.
A ferocious appetite was building outside to be part of Steve's tossed salad. And no one became more famous, more infamous at tossing it than Steve's unflappable right hand, Mark Beneke.
Oh, Mark Beneke had a certain hauteur, which was perfectly suited for his job.
2 out there, please, on the left.
I mean, Mark could stand at the front because he had been at it for a while, and there'd be somebody right in front of him, and he would not even look at him. And the guy'd be talking to him, please let me in, you know, I'll do anything.
He would just look right, you'd be like right there, and he'd be like, there was nothing. It was clear, it was transparent, it was arrogant.
I remember one night standing there and they didn't let Cher in. And she says, well, I'm Cher. And Mark Beneke says, yeah, I know who you are. Hold on.
Some celebrities get special treatment, others don't.
I was like, whoa, now this is the spot.
Dario! Here we go! Can you get me into studio?
You know, the whole thing was so ridiculous and absurd, you know, and so I just took the absurdity to its greatest height.
Having a great time. 2 out there, please.
It was theater out there. I think people have to look at it in that context, that there was as much of a show outside as there was inside.
You got to see the limousines pulling up and the celebrities arriving.
A lot easier also to meet people online. You're outside, you can see what people look like. People all had the same goal. If they all got rejected and met some very nice girls.
One of the great ironies of all this is that if Steve and Ian didn't own Studio 54, many believe they would have never been allowed in.
He wouldn't have been able to get in. I wouldn't have let him in. I certainly wouldn't have let Ian in.
So how did 2 guys who wouldn't be admitted to their own club get their own club?
Well, Brooklyn made me hungry.
I mean, here was a kid from Brooklyn who went to Syracuse University, you know, was running a pizza business up there, a pizza delivery business. I mean, and suddenly was the arbiter of New York nightlife, of international nightlife.
Ian and I grew up in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, but we didn't know each other because, you know, you can be like 2 feet away from somebody and not know them, you know, there. So we met up at Syracuse and we became friends.
After graduating, Ian went on to become a real estate lawyer. And then later, when the more aggressive Steve wanted to expand his fledgling restaurant business, he called on his old friend to help him out. Together, they opened a meat and potatoes chain called Steak Lofts. Even then, there were subtle hints that they wanted to do something a little sexier. So they redesigned one of their steak lofts into a flashy night spot in thoroughly unfashionable Queens. It was called the Enchanted Garden, and Richie Notar was one of their first employees.
Being in a Queens discotheque was not the coolest thing, but it was, for Queens style, it was great.
Meanwhile, in Manhattan, an enormous building sat empty on 54th Street.
The place was sitting there for years, empty. Nobody had the balls to take it.
For 30 years, 254 West 54th Street had been a CBS radio and television studio where shows like What's My Line, The $64,000 Question, and The Jackie Gleason Show had originated. CBS moved their studios to California in the early 70s, and then in 1976, a German socialite named Uwe Harden wandered into the building, saw the potential, and signed a lease to open the largest nightclub the world had ever seen.
I think there's going to be a big change. Uwe had the idea. You know, was really a man about town and knew a lot of cool people. He put the whole thing together.
You get the money, the idea, the people behind you, you apply for a liquor license and you open it.
Enter Carmen D'Alessio, who virtually invented the art of party promotion in Manhattan. She had been working with Uwe in creating his mammoth new space, and also with Steve and Ian in their faraway Queens night spot. So when Uwe lost his financial backing, Carmen brought them all together.
So I decided it was time for the guys to come and check out the Big Apple. So I brought them hand in hand, and they saw the space, and they were just in awe because they liked it so much. I think that Uber was just paid off like a finder's fee, but they raised additional money through a silent partner, Jacques Duché, and the rest is history.
In the winter of 1976, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager became the new proprietors of the daunting building at 254 West 54th Street.
You know, Studio 54 was conceived, built, and opened within 6 weeks. So it was like this, spontaneous rush.
So here they were, two very different guys. Ian was straight and painfully shy. Steve was gay and fiercely sociable, but both shared common roots in the outer boroughs they now disdained as the new owners of the most exclusive and glamorous nightclub in the history of nightlife.
I became friendly with Steve. He was a very friendly, gregarious guy.
He'd jump in on everything. He was really obnoxious. He was an adorable, lovable person, but I didn't take him very seriously.
Steve was like a big kid in a toy store.
I was quite rude to him many times. The one I took seriously was Ian Schrager.
Ian Schrager, nobody knew. His nickname was Greta, as in Greta Garbo, you know.
I bet people never even realized there was a man called Ian Schrager.
I never had any contact whatsoever with Ian Schrager. I couldn't even tell you what he looked like.
Ian was always in charge of making sure the sound was fabulous and the lighting. And
I love design. It's really the way I express myself. So it's just like part of the tools we use in creating the space. We've had no training.
Steve was...
So those pictures of Studio 4 start to give us, and some of the footage start to give us a glimpse as to what the space actually looked like. So obviously there's a number of architectural plans and designs that still exist and have been well documented from the building. Someone got their hands on it and digitally recreated it in a 3D model to sort of take you through what Studio 4 might have been like. Again, it's highly synthesized, but I think is useful in showing the extravagance and glamour of a space where you usually just get a small pictorial view. So let me pull up our last listening example. Before I play the last minute of it, that last shot where you can see the balcony really gives a tip of the hat to the older construction of the building. So again, initially it was a theater, and then CBS bought it sort of as a media station of sorts, doing television and radio. They kept that sort of same theatrical seating style when CBS owned the building, and still maintained an element of it when Studio 54 ends up being in the same building, which is an interesting but very cool design choice. The price tag on fixing this building and getting it ready for opening night, I believe, was $400,000, which does not include the equation for inflation and such, but a huge undertaking for a relatively small space that had not been like dilapidated or anything like that. It was still in good shape. It was just being used for a completely different purpose. So let's watch the remainder of this walkthrough, which is only a little bit so again, what was remarkable about this space is there were somewhat movable elements that would change, make the space a little bit different on the day-to-day basis based on who was there or what special event was being run. And talking a little bit about the event planner who kind of made a perfect storm in terms of collaborators that set up Studio 54. Marketing for Studio 54 was huge. One of the things that was really wonderful to see were the copies of the invitations that were really always on theme with the very disco kind of aesthetic. And these invitations and screen prints, kind of party favors, memorabilia of sorts from each of these events are highly stylized documents. Again, just really drawing attention to detail and the lavishness that was a part of the nightlife at this particular venue. So in parts 3 and 4, which are going to be significantly more succinct, we'll talk about the musical characteristics of disco, what makes a disco tune identifiable as a representation from that particular genre, and do so through a survey of listening from a number of artists that were represented on the soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever. So I will see you back for part 3 shortly.